Bridger Mountains, Montana Territory, November 1876. Before dawn, the whole valley is the color of old steel, that thin blue pre-light where the sky hasn't decided if it's morning yet, and the wind is already screaming over the ridge as if it's angry you're still alive. Snow has blown all night, piling into drifts that climb chest-high against the rough log cabins scattered along the timberline. This was winter. This was the difference between survival and catastrophe. Doors are frozen shut, latches welded in ice. You see men in wool and buffalo hide leaning their shoulders into warped planks, cursing under their breath as the wind knifes through every gap in every wall. Breath turns to crystals on beards. One cabin door finally jerks open, and a curtain of snow spills inside, dusting a bed where the blankets are already rimmed white at the edges. Now, let's see what Jacob built. At first glance, his cabin looks wrong. The walls are absurdly thick, the window openings small and recessed like arrow slits, the roofline riding low under a heavy cap of snow that seems ready to crush it. In a row of tall, proud frontier cabins, Jacob Reinhardt's place squats there like a stubborn stone box that forgot it was supposed to be made of logs. The wind hits it and slides off. The sky is still black when Jacob steps out. No coat. Shirt sleeves rolled to the forearms, vest half-buttoned, as if he's just stepped from a summer kitchen. Steam drifts from his breath, but there's no shiver, no frantic stomp to wake up frozen feet. He pauses, listening to the wind moan in the pines above the settlement, then kicks a little ridge of powder away from his threshold with the casual annoyance of a man brushing sawdust off a bench. Across the clearing, his neighbors notice. Samuel Creek yanks at a stubborn latch with both hands, boots hammering the packed snow. "Look at that," he mutters, watching Jacob stand there like the cold is an inconvenience, not a threat. Behind him, his wife pulls an ice-stiff blanket away from the wall, shaking frost crystals onto the floor. "You built a fort to freeze in," William Thorpe had told Jacob when the first logs went up. "2 walls with a gap between, 18 inches of empty space, then filled with stone. Those walls will never dry. You'll rot in there before you thaw. Around here, cabin wisdom said you built fast. Single wall, chink the gaps, keep the fire roaring, and pray the wind didn't shift." What did the stubborn mountain man understand that 2 generations of frontiersmen had missed about heat and cold in these mountains? Before we reveal the exact technique, watch this moment. Jacob turns back to his door. The hinges don't groan. The latch isn't frozen. As the plank swings inward, a visible wave of air rolls out, fogging, thickening, blooming into the frigid blue like someone just opened a bakery oven into a meat locker. The nearest men actually step back, because in a winter that can drive a normal cabin to 38 degrees inside, Jacob's wrong cabin breathes out warmth that feels like late September. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century is hiding in those heavy walls of stone and timber. And on this cold dawn in the Bridgers, every skeptical neighbor can suddenly feel it on their face. That warmth on their faces made sense at dawn. It made no sense at all 12 hours earlier. Cut back to the night before. Bridger Mountains, Montana Territory, January 1877. The blizzard doesn't fall, it attacks. Wind-driven snow hits the cabin sideways, grains of ice moving so fast they sting bare skin like sand. The sound outside is a constant roar. The sound inside is worse. Timbers groaning, shingles lifting, iron stoves roaring like they're angry. Temperatures plunge past minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. That's not put on another sweater cold. That's your lungs burn when you breathe cold. In this kind of winter, a design mistake isn't just uncomfortable. It can be the difference between survival and catastrophe. Inside a typical cabin, the fire is at full blast, flames licking high, stoveplates glowing a dull red. Yet frost creeps in from the corners, tracing delicate white ferns along the log seams. Every exhale hangs in the air. You can see the breath of every person in that room, even standing right next to the stove. A water bucket in the corner forms a skin of ice by midnight. The youngest kids sleep in wool coats and mittens, wrapped in every blanket the family owns. Their boots are lined up by the hearth, not to dry, but to keep them from freezing stiff. Someone is always awake, feeding that stove. Miss one turn with the wood and the cabin cools frighteningly fast. You can almost feel the heat leaking straight through those single log walls, out into the Black Mountains. This was normal. This was frontier life. And Jacob's neighbors were proud of how well they'd built their cabins, right up until the wind started knifing through every gap they thought they'd sealed. Now, let's see what Jacob built. Same night, same storm. His cabin sits in the teeth of that blizzard. Snow piles against the outer wall, wind clawing at the eaves. But inside, the scene is wrong. His stove door is barely cracked. No raging fire. Just a bed of slow-burning coals, a faint orange glow. Yet the walls are quietly radiating a gentle, even warmth. No ice feathers on the inside of the shutters. No glittering frost in the corners. The window glass is clear, not fogged and freezing. On the back wall, a cheap tin thermometer holds at a steady, almost unbelievable 68 degrees Fahrenheit. His neighbors burn through 2.5 cords of wood a week and fight for 40 degrees. Jacob sits in shirt sleeves at 68 with half the firewood. You can imagine the looks he got when that number was read aloud. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about heat that 2 generations of frontiersmen had missed? Before we reveal the exact technique, remember the stakes. At minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, 1 bad night of cold, 1 fever, 1 case of frostbite can decide who wakes up in the morning. Jacob has bet his life and his family's on a wall every man in that valley called a mistake. The camera follows one neighbor pushing Jacob's door open that night. He steps inside, starts to say, "You'll never keep," and stops. Mid-sentence, the warmth hits him like a wave. He blinks, looks at the small lazy fire, then at the thick impossible wall of stone and timber. "How? Is it this warm in here?" he whispers. The shot lingers on that wall, on the hidden stone, on knowledge that's been buried for over a century, right before we finally cut it open. The neighbor's question just hangs there in the warm air. How? Is it this warm in here? So let's step back for a second and frame what you're actually looking at, because Jacob Reinhardt did not just get lucky. This wasn't a fluke fire, a calm night, or a convenient break in the wind. This cabin, on the coldest winter in 40 years, kept running the same quiet experiment night after night while the mountains tried to crush it with cold. His neighbors had followed 2 generations of frontier wisdom. Single log wall, pipe notches, chink the gaps, bigger stove if you could afford it. That was the recipe. You burned more wood, you stayed more warm. Simple. Jacob looked at that recipe and walked the other way. From the outside, his place looked wrong. The wall was too thick, the windows too small, the foundation built like it was holding up a bank vault instead of a one-room shack. Men riding past laughed that he was building a fort to fight the winter. One even joked he'd freeze behind all that stone before Christmas. They were only half right. He was building a fort, just not the way they understood it. Here's the real question. What did the stubborn mountain man understand about heat, walls, and winter that even experienced trappers and homesteaders completely overlooked? Because the numbers don't lie. While standard cabins in that valley struggled to claw their way to the low 40s inside, Jacob's cabin sat in the mid-60s by evening and only drifted down into the 50s by dawn, even with the fire out. His neighbors were burning through 2.4 to 2.8 cords of wood every week. Jacob used about half that and stayed warmer. That is not luck. That is design. And here's where the mystery deepens. He didn't have a giant iron stove. He didn't line the place with fur. He didn't double the number of logs in the wall or pack it with hay. The secret lies in a wall that looks like a mistake. 2 log shells, an 18-inch cavity, and nearly 8,000 pounds of stone sitting quietly between them. Before we reveal the exact technique, pause and think about your own world, your cabin, your shed, that tiny home project, or the drafty spare room in a perfectly modern house. You've probably been told the same thing Jacob's neighbors believed. More insulation, bigger heater, problem solved. But what if the real leverage is not in more, it's in how you arrange the mass and the air? Because heat does not move through a wall the way most people picture it. It flows, it soaks, it leaks along hidden bridges of wood and nail and stone. A still air gap can act like a blanket. A badly placed board can act like a ladder for cold. Get that wrong, and you feed the fire all night. Get it right, and a single slow fire charges your walls like a battery. What Jacob built in that little mountain cabin was a crude thermal machine, a simple, almost accidental looking structure that turned dense stone and trapped air into the difference between survival and catastrophe. And the same physics that saved him firewood and maybe his life are sitting there waiting to be used in your walls today. Now, let's see what Jacob built, layer by layer, and why that wrong wall beat the cold when the blizzards finally closed in. But to understand why his wrong wall mattered, you have to see what everyone else was living in. Standard Montana cabins in 1876 were fast work, not fine work. Single log walls, rough-hewn, notched at the corners, stacked as high as a man could reach. The gaps between them were crammed with moss, mud, straw, horsehair, whatever the mountains offered that day. Inside, if you were lucky, a small iron stove squatted in the corner, or a rough stone fireplace smoked against one wall. This was normal. This was frontier life. On a mild day, that cabin felt almost romantic. Fire popping, resin smell from the logs, orange light on hand-hewn beams. But when the real winter came down off the Bridgers, those same walls started to move. Logs shrank as they dried, twisted under their own weight. The neat chinking the family had pressed in September cracked open by December. By January, it was falling out in gray crumbs onto the swept dirt floor. Wind didn't just seep in. It whistled through the corners like the cabin was a flute. You'd see the candle flame lean toward the wall when a gust hit. Frost grew in feathery fans on the inside of the logs, and the tiny panes of glass turned opaque with ice. Children would trace their names in it before breakfast, wearing mittens. What did this stubborn mountain man understand, staring at his neighbors' cabins, that 2 generations of frontiersmen had ignored? That the enemy wasn't just the cold outside. It was the way their walls helped the cold win. Heat was leaking out 3 different ways, all at once. Through the solid logs themselves, warmth conducted grain to bark, then straight into the night. Through every crack and gap, hot air rushed out and cold air rushed in. A constant, invisible river called convection, and from the bright side of the stove, radiant heat shot in straight lines to the nearest thin spot or window and vanished into the dark. You could feel it in the rhythm of the night. A family would load the stove hard at 9 o'clock for an hour, maybe 2. The cabin felt almost warm. Then the fire settled, the iron cooled, and the room temperature crashed. By midnight, the air near the bed might be hovering in the low 40s. By 2 in the morning, if the fire died, that cabin had lost most of its stored warmth. So they lived by the alarm clock of the cold. Parents woke every few hours, half asleep, to jam in more wood. Children woke to frozen boots, ice in the wash basin, and their own breath hanging in the air like smoke. Neighbors didn't complain about it. They bragged about it. "That's winter," they'd say, as if frost on your pillow were a character-building exercise. Before we reveal the exact technique Jacob used, remember this. No one thought the cabin itself was the problem. The suffering was just how it is in the mountains, which is why his heavy, strange-looking walls landed like an insult. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century started with one man asking a forbidden question. What if the cabin was wrong, not the winter? So, let's walk into a normal frontier cabin on a sub-zero night and actually follow the heat. You're standing by the iron stove. The fire roars. Your face feels almost too warm. Your back still stings with cold. For a moment, it feels like victory over the winter. But press pause in your mind and trace where every single bit of that heat goes over the next few hours. Most people never did that. They just threw on more wood. First, the air near the stove explodes with warmth. Hot air rises, rolls across the ceiling, then slides down the log walls. Those logs look thick, solid, safe. But watch in slow motion, the energy doesn't stay floating in the air like a cozy cloud. It slams into the interior surface, seeps into the wood, and starts racing outward toward the cold. Every place a log touches the outside world without interruption becomes a hidden escape route. That's conduction. A silent, steady leak. No howling draft, no whistle, just heat marching down a solid path from warm to cold, hour after hour. Now look at the corners, those beautiful dovetail joints everyone admired. To a physicist, they're heat highways, continuous wood from inside face to outside face. Same with the log ends sticking out into the wind, white with frost. They're radiating precious warmth straight into the Montana night. And the neighbor's pride and joy, a shiny metal stovepipe punching through the roof. From their point of view, it meant a strong draw and a good fire. From the fire's point of view, it was a steel ladder for heat to sprint outside. Metal, with its high conductivity, doesn't just vent smoke. It drags heat with it. This is where the idea of thermal bridges comes in. Anywhere you have an unbroken solid material connecting inside to outside, log ends, nail-studded window frames, that pipe, you've built a bridge. Not for people, for heat. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about those bridges that 2 generations of frontiersmen ignored? Most builders fought the enemy they could feel, drafts. They stuffed moss in gaps, mud in cracks, rags around window frames. If the wind stopped whistling, they called the cabin tight and went back to hauling firewood. But the real enemy, the one you couldn't see or hear, was conduction through those solid paths. Jacob's mind went somewhere else. If the heat wanted to move into the walls so badly, why fight it with more fire? Why not redesign the wall so that when heat flowed in, it didn't vanish, it stored up? Imagine a wall that doesn't just block winter for a moment, but soaks up warmth and then bleeds it back into the room, hour after hour, like a slow battery. No roaring flames at midnight, no panic when the fire goes low. Before we reveal the exact technique, ask yourself, if you had to bet your life on one idea, more fire or a wall that could hold heat, what would you build in those mountains? Hold that thought. Cut hard from the 1870s lantern glow to a drone shot over a modern off-grid cabin tucked in the trees. Metal roof, solar panels, tiny wood stove chimney just breathing. Different century, same problem. You, 4 walls, and a winter that does not care. This isn't just Jacob's story. This is your cabin, your tiny house, your shed you're trying to make livable. Whether you're feeding a little cast iron stove, a propane heater, or a high-efficiency electric unit, the same physics that kept his stone-filled walls warm in the Montana mountains are working for, or against, you right now. Heat doesn't care about the calendar. It only cares about mass, air, and pathways to escape. Most small cabins today still lose heat the way those frontier shacks did. Thin walls, leaky corners, and solid bridges that carry warmth straight out into the cold. You can throw a bigger stove at that, or you can make the walls do half the work. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that most modern builders still ignore? That you don't win winter just at the firebox. You win it in the layers between inside and outside, in how you arrange wood, air, and stone, so the cabin holds onto every degree you fought for. Now, let's see what Jacob built. But through your eyes. In a minute, we're going to break his wall apart on screen, board by board and stone by stone, until you could sketch it on a napkin. 2 shells. A hidden cavity. Nearly 8,000 pounds of riverstone acting as a slow, silent battery. By the time we're done, you'll be able to adapt that idea to a 12 by 16 shed or a full-time off-grid cabin and actually understand why it works. Before we reveal the exact technique, you should know this isn't just a museum piece. Builders today echo Jacob in 3 main ways. Double stud walls that trap still air and cut heat loss. Scandinavian liner walls where an inner log or frame wall creates a quiet, insulated cavity inside an older shell. And heavy thermal mass builds, adobe, earth, or stone, that soak up daytime heat and bleed it back all night. We'll put Jacob's wrong wall right next to those modern systems and show you where they match, where they differ, and how you can steal ideas from each. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century is suddenly a toolbox. Ways to burn less wood, shrink your propane bill, and keep your cabin warm long after the fire goes out. So as we go back to that little Montana cabin, Don't just ask, how big a stove do I need? Ask Jacob's question instead. How can I make these walls carry the load so the fire doesn't have to? Because in a deep winter, that shift can be the difference between survival and catastrophe. Next, we open his walls up. But to understand what you're seeing, you have to understand the man who drew them into existence. Jacob Reinhardt did not start as a builder. He started as a body trying not to freeze. Montana Territory, early 1870s. Jacob is a trapper, sometimes a survey hand, drifting with the snow line and the fur prices. He winters in whatever cabin or shack is standing. Single-wall log boxes with daylight showing through the chinks, low-sod roofs that weep meltwater onto blankets, plank shanties that go cold the moment the fire dies. He watches men wake up with beards frozen to their bedrolls. He watches a survey partner lose 2 toes after a week in a drafty line shack that never climbs above freezing. Long before he sketches a single wall, he's already obsessed with one question: how do you stay warm without feeding a fire all night? No books on heat transfer, but he has time and he has the mountains. On a militia job, he sleeps inside a rough military fort, stone bastions at the corners, timber infill between. The officers complain about the damp. Jacob notices something else. Long after the stove is banked, the interior stone stays faintly warm to the touch, while the timber sections cool fast. On a survey near a Scandinavian homestead, he's invited into a strange cabin, a double-walled house, inner logs and outer boards with a narrow air gap. The fire goes out before midnight. At dawn, his breath doesn't fog the air. The walls feel quiet, still. The cold presses against the outside, but it doesn't rush in. Weeks later, he's bunking in a mining camp. The bunkhouse is ugly, thrown together from thick plank walls, nearly 3 inches each, nailed tight, crude, but heavy. Again, he notices, when the stove dies, the air cools, but the walls themselves seem to give some of that heat back. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that his neighbors missed? He can't write equations, but he can feel patterns. He starts cataloging cabins in his head. Which ones feel warm at dawn? Which ones snap cold the instant the fire drops? Which cabins roar with drafts? Which cabins have a dense, muffled silence? He presses his palm to log, to plank, to stone, and files away the memory. This leaks. To the men around him, he's just that quiet fellow with odd ideas, the one who asks how thick the wall is instead of how big the stove is. Trappers roll their eyes. Miners joke that he's courting the logs. Nobody's asking his opinion on construction, and that makes what he does next even stranger. Before we reveal the exact technique, picture Jacob alone in a lamplit cabin, hunched over a scrap of survey paper. The wind scrapes along the eaves. He draws 2 parallel lines, 2 walls, not one. Between them, he shades a gap. In the gap, he writes in blunt, cramped letters, "Stone here. Off to the side, no wind in the space." He underlines it twice. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century is condensing into a rough pencil sketch, not a bigger fire, but a wall that could carry the load. In the next section, we'll see how that sketch became a cabin that turned a Montana winter from a slow disaster into the difference between survival and catastrophe. When Jacob stepped out with his measuring rope the next morning, he wasn't alone. Word travels fast in a valley where winter can kill you just for being careless. Samuel Creek was the first to wander over. Respected trapper, 30 winters in those mountains, 27 cabins built with his own hands. Behind him came William Thorpe, the trader who'd supplied half the timber for the Bridger cabins, and Thomas Brickner, a former army carpenter who could lay out a sill with his eyes half closed and a hangover. To Jacob, they weren't just neighbors. They were the local textbooks. Samuel spat into the frost and squinted at the sketch in Jacob's hand. "You don't need drawings for a cabin," he said. "Denotch the logs this way, pack the chinks, slap on a roof, and you're done. Don't overthink it. We've been doing this for 2 generations. Thomas nodded, tapping a calloused finger on an imaginary log line, already explaining where the corners should lock, how high the walls needed to go before you even thought about rafters. This was the script. Single wall. tight notches, moss and mud in the gaps, fire roaring all winter just to keep the cold from crawling across the floor. Jacob listened. He asked where they'd put the door to dodge the prevailing wind, how they laid their foundations on frozen ground, what diameter logs held heat best. Then he made the mistake of telling them the part that wasn't in their script. "I'm thinking of a double wall," he said quietly, with stone between. Silence for a beat. Then it hit. Samuel barked out a laugh so sharp it startled the horses. William shook his head, the way you do when a man tells you he's going to sail to Europe in a washtub. Thomas actually grinned. "You'll rot those logs from the inside," he warned. "Trap moisture, grow mold, freeze yourself out. That's wasting good timber on a fool idea." Their logic wasn't random. More wall meant more work, more material to haul, more surface for moisture to creep in, more angles for the wind to find. In their minds, thick didn't mean warm. It meant trouble. Every extra inch of wall was another path for cold to sneak through checks and seams, another place to trap damp air that would turn to ice. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that they didn't? To them, the proven cabin was the one still standing after 20 Januaries. You don't argue with survival. Before we reveal the exact technique, watch what Jacob does here. He doesn't fight. He nods, thanks them, even lets Samuel walk off a 10 by 12 footprint in the snow, the standard box that had kept a lot of men barely warm and barely alive. They leave convinced they've talked sense into the immigrant with the accent and the strange ideas about stone. Then the camera would stay on Jacob. He walks back into the clearing, alone now, and resets his stakes. One here, another far wider than Samuel's line. He stretches the rope, marks out a footprint clearly too wide for a normal, single-wall cabin, a rectangle that only makes sense if you're hiding another wall inside the first. Now, let's see what Jacob built once he committed to that mistake, and how those extra inches of wall turned into the difference between survival and catastrophe. Freeze that moment right there. Jacob standing over that too-wide footprint, first log ready to roll into place, neighbors whispering that he's about to waste a whole winter on a wrong wall. Before we reveal the exact technique he used between those lines of logs and stone, this is where you come in. If you've ever looked at a standard wall or a code-approved cabin detail and thought, does this actually make sense in real cold? Hit like right now. Because that question, that tiny act of doubt about the way it's always been done, is exactly what separates Jacob from the men whose cabins froze at 38 degrees. Drop a comment too. Tell us where you're watching from and what kind of winter you face. Are you fighting damp 25-degree coastal cold? High plains minus 20 with wind screaming down off the mountains? Dry interior cold that saws through a single log wall by 3 a.m. Those real climates are where this kind of wall either saves you or betrays you. Here's why you'll want to stick around and subscribe before Jacob sets that first course. In a follow-up video, we're going to build his wall next to a modern normal wall and wire them like lab experiments. Same size cabin bay, same heater, same Montana-style cold, thermal cameras watching every square foot, sensors buried in the stone core, in the log faces, in the air gap, feeding real temperature curves over 24 hours. We're not just telling you it felt warm. We're going to show you which wall actually holds heat when the fire dies. And in the next minutes of this video, you're getting the blueprint, precise wall dimensions, how far Jacob pushed those log lines apart, and why 12 inches would fail where 18 inches worked. Stone placement strategies, why dense river stone went low, sandstone climbed the wall, and what happens if you mix sizes wrong and create cold chimneys. How he controlled the air gap so it insulated instead of turning into a hidden draft channel that sucked heat straight out of the cabin. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about heat that 2 generations of frontiersmen and a century of fiberglass marketing quietly skipped? That slow, heavy heat in a wall can be more valuable than a high R number on paper. Modern insulation ads shout R values and spray foam. Almost no one talks about knowledge that's been buried for over a century. That you can turn cheap, local stone and smart framing into a thermal battery. No patent, No branded panel, just rocks, wood, and physics. Maybe that's why you don't see this on the brochure rack. Now, let's see what Jacob built when that first log finally drops into place, and how every pound of stone he lifted changed the way his cabin met the winter cold. Now, let's see what Jacob built. From the road, it looked wrong. Too heavy, too low, too few windows staring out at the mountains. The other cabins along the creek were tall, proud log boxes with big gables and generous glass. Jacob's place? Squat, thick, almost hunched into the ground as if it expected the winter to hit it like a hammer. That's because Jacob wasn't building a house. He was building a machine. In his head, this wasn't a cute frontier cabin with a cozy fire. It was a heat battery and a shield. Every log, every stone, every narrow opening was part of a single idea: slow the heat, store the heat, and redirect the heat instead of just throwing more wood at the cold and hoping for the best. His neighbors did not see that. They saw overkill. They saw the double wall go up. One log wall outside, another inside, with that strange 1/8-inch gap between, and shook their heads. One man joked he was building a fort. Another said it looked more like a low castle than a cabin. A third, less charitable, called it a stone coffin and asked if Jacob planned to climb in and freeze to death in style. You can hear the mockery, right? On the frontier, clever often loses to proven. The single-wall cabin had 2 centuries of American momentum behind it. You stacked logs. You chinked the gaps. You burned more wood when it got cold. That was normal. That was frontier life. So what did this stubborn mountain man understand that they didn't? Before we reveal the exact technique, you need to see his mindset. Traditional cabins were like thin coats in a blizzard. They blocked the wind, but bled heat as soon as the fire died. Jacob wanted the opposite. He wanted a thick, dense core that would drink in heat all day and then bleed it back, slowly, long after the last flame went out. That is why the walls look strange. Too thick, windows too small, tucked under deep eaves. Roofline pulled down low. Every odd choice is a clue. That 1/8-inch cavity? It isn't wasted space. It's where nearly 8,000 pounds of stone will sit, wrapped in wood, surrounded by controlled air, turning his cabin into a thermal flywheel. This is not about staying warm while the fire roars. Jacob is designing for when the fire goes low. He assumes the worst night, the moment you oversleep. The hour the wind rises and the coals fade. His goal is simple and brutally practical. Keep the interior temperature stable, in the safe zone, even when the stove is quiet, in a place where a single bad night can be the difference between survival and catastrophe. That changes everything. And as the walls climb higher and the gap begins to fill, the stone coffin starts to look less like a joke and more like knowledge that's been buried for over a century, taking shape in plain sight. The question is, will it actually work when the first real cold hits? To see why it might work, you have to see what it was up against. A normal cabin in those mountains started in the woods with the sound of an axe and the smell of green sap. Men felled the straightest pines they could find, limbed them, dragged them back with a team or a half-starved mule, and eyed them like firewood that had been promoted to wall duty. No one was talking about heat flow. They were talking about getting a roof before the first real winter storm. The walls went up fast. A rough saddle notch hacked into each end, logs stacked to shoulder height, maybe a little higher if you were ambitious. You didn't measure gaps in fractions of an inch. You just prayed the logs were straight enough that daylight didn't pour through. Whatever spaces were left got plugged with whatever was at hand: moss, mud, dried grass, scraps of cloth, even horse manure if you were desperate. This was called chinking. It was also called good enough. Corners? They were a suggestion, not a seal. Imperfect notches left little diagonal tunnels where wind loved to snake through. The sill logs often sat directly on uneven ground or a few random stones, which meant the entire cabin rested on a wavy, leaky perimeter. No sill gasket, no real barrier between inside air and the outside, just luck, mud, and a hope that the snow would drift high enough to help. Inside, you felt the consequences. Midwinter, when the wind came hard off the ridge, it drove snow so fine it behaved like smoke, sifting through hairline cracks and landing in little white dunes along the base of the wall. A constant draft crept across the floor, licking at ankles. There was a cold band a foot or two out from every wall where no one wanted to sit. Children learned fast that moving their bed 6 inches closer to the center meant the difference between numb toes and merely aching ones. With the stove roaring, you could bully the interior up to 60, maybe 65 degrees Fahrenheit. It felt triumphantly warm compared to the minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit outside. But the moment the fire died, midnight, when the last log collapsed into coals, the cabin told the truth. By 2 a.m, that single log wall had dumped most of its borrowed heat back to the night. The air inside slumped toward freezing, 34, 35 degrees Fahrenheit, your breath visible in the moonlight. Someone had to crawl out from under blankets, restack the firebox, and sit there shivering while the iron warmed again. Every night, all winter. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that his neighbors didn't? That this wasn't just bad weather. It was bad walls, yet on the frontier, nobody blamed the cabin. Burning through an entire woodpile by February, cutting another cord in snow up to your waist, was simply the cost of survival. This was normal. This was frontier life. Before we reveal the exact technique Jacob used, you need that baseline in your bones. The drafts, the cold band, the frantic midnight relights. Because against that, his heavy, strange, stone-filled walls wouldn't just be a curiosity. They would be a quiet revolution. Frontier builders didn't talk about physics. They talked about drafty and tight, about burns hot and eats wood. But every one of those midnight relights was the result of 3 quiet forces Jacob had been watching for years. How heat conducts, how air convects, and how radiation leaks out of a cabin into the night. Touch a hot stove, you learn at once. Heat flows through solid materials that are touching, from warm to cold, like water seeking a lower level. In a standard log cabin, each log is a wooden bridge from your fire-warmed interior straight to the Montana winter outside. Every notch, every nail, every continuous grain of wood is a little highway for heat to escape through the wall. Then there's convection. Moving air. You felt it when a gust sneaks under the door and suddenly your ankles are freezing. Hot air rises off the stove, slides along the ceiling, cools against the outer wall, then sinks as a slow, invisible waterfall of cold across the floor. That loop can steal more warmth than the logs themselves. If those loops get fast enough, the whole cabin becomes a machine designed to move heat out of your body and into the cold. Radiation is stranger. Heat that travels in straight lines, like light. Stand in front of a fire, and your face burns while your back stays cold. Stand near a single log wall at 40 below, and you can feel your body radiating heat at it, like a human stove trying to warm the forest. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that his neighbors did not? That you can't win a winter war with firepower alone. You have to control the battlefield, control conduction, control convection, control radiation. That's where mass comes in. Picture a thin tin cup of boiling water. Leave it on the table. 10 minutes later, it's lukewarm. Now imagine a big cast iron pot pulled from the same fire. Hours later, it's still giving off steam. Same water, same starting heat, different amount of mass holding it. Jacob wanted his walls to behave like that cast iron. Thermal mass is just a way of saying heavy, dense material that can soak up heat slowly and give it back slowly. Stone, brick, thick earth. Wood has some. Stone has more. In the mountains, stone was free, if you were stubborn enough to haul it. But here's the twist. Mass alone isn't enough. Still air is one of the best insulators on Earth if you trap it so it can't start those convective loops. That's why down jackets work. Thousands of tiny feathers holding millions of tiny pockets of air in place. That's why a double-pane window feels warm inside when it's bitterly cold outside. A thin, sealed layer of air takes the hit. A wall, Jacob realized, doesn't have to be just a barrier. It can be a system, a place where daytime or fire heat is stored in heavy stone. while carefully controlled air gaps slow down both conduction and convection. Then that stored warmth leaks back into the cabin all night through gentle radiation. Done right, that system smooths the brutal temperature swings that made his neighbors wake to ice on their blankets. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century says, combine mass with still air, and you turn a wall into a battery. So what happens if, instead of one thick log wall, you build two, leave a gap, and fill that gap with dense stone, while trapping air where you want it and blocking it where you don't? What happens when a mountain man rebuilds the frontier cabin from the inside out? Now, let's see what Jacob built. From the outside, his cabin still looked like a cabin. Rough-hewn logs, chinked tight, crouched against the wind with the Bridger Mountains rising behind it. But inside that outer wall, hidden from his neighbors' smirks, Jacob was building a second cabin, a full inner log wall, 2 shells of wood with a deliberate gap between them that was neither solid nor open. A controlled cavity. The outer wall carried the fight with the weather. Big logs, heavier, a little rougher, meant to take the snow load and the hammering of winter storms. Inside, about 18 inches away, he raised a second log wall, slightly smaller in diameter but smoother, carefully peeled and fitted so the interior would feel finished, not like the inside of a barn. You wouldn't see that 1/8-inch space from the yard. But that gap was where the real heat game was being played. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that his neighbors, stacking single rows of logs, had missed? He understood that if you just left a hollow space, it would become a wind tunnel, a cold pump. But if you filled it wrong, made it one solid bridge of wood or stone from inside to outside, you would bleed heat straight through the wall. So he split the difference on purpose. From ground level up to about 7 feet, that cavity was destined to be heavy. Jacob planned to pack it with stone and earth, layer upon layer, tamped tight, river rock, sandstone, and compacted soil forming a dense inner belt around the cabin. Above that, from roughly 7 feet up to the roofline, he would leave the gap mostly as still air, not empty, controlled, interrupted by cross-bracing and chinking so air could hardly move. Before we reveal the exact technique he used to lock all that stone in place, you need to see the logic. Down low, where cold creeps in and where the stove throws most of its heat, he wanted mass, thousands of pounds of it, to soak up warmth during the day and bleed it back at night. Higher up, where hot air naturally collects, he wanted insulation, a quiet trapped air band that slowed the escape of that precious heat. The result was a continuous thermal belt. That stone and earth core ran almost unbroken around the cabin, from the foundation stones at the corners right up to Jacob's shoulder height. No big gaps, no weak spots at the corners, just a ring of mass that turned his walls into a low, heavy battery. Above it, the air cavity wrapped the room like a padded coat. Picture a cutaway. You're standing inside, hand on smooth inner logs. Behind them, unseen, on 1/8-inch thickness of layered stone and packed earth rises to your face. Then a band of still air. Then the outer log wall, taking the blizzard. Wood, stone, trapped air. 3 layers between you and 40 degrees of killing cold. In a winter where the difference between survival and catastrophe might be a few degrees on a frosted thermometer, Jacob's cabin is no longer just a box. It's a shell, engineered from knowledge that's been buried for over a century, waiting to show you what happens when that stone core finally meets fire. Now, let's see what Jacob built when that shell met the ground. He doesn't just drop a cabin anywhere there's a flat spot. He walks the slope above Samuel Creek's place, watching the way the grass leans in the afternoon wind, noting where the snow lingers in shadow. South of the main trail, he finds it, a gentle bench, tucked just below a low rise that blunts the north wind, open to the southern sun, and, this is important, within hauling distance of 2 stone outcrops. To his neighbors, it's just ugly rock. To Jacob, it's free foundation and future heat. The eastern spur holds dense riverstone, rounded but heavy. The southern ledge carries fractured sandstone, blocky and easy to stack. He's not thinking about pretty. He's thinking about weight, contact, and how that weight will drink in heat long after winter has locked the mountains in ice. What did the stubborn mountain man understand that the others, racing to raise walls before snow, refused to see? Then he does the first crazy thing. Instead of scraping the topsoil and setting logs on a few boulders like everyone else, Jacob strings lines, marks his corners, and starts digging. 2 feet, 3, 4. He doesn't stop until his shovel rings hard on bedrock and packed glacial till. Reinhardt's digging his own grave. One neighbor laughs, leaning on a fence post. Cabin's on top, Jacob, not underneath. But Jacob keeps cutting that trench, about 4 feet down, wide enough that it looks more like the start of a fortification than a homestead. He knows frost doesn't just attack from the air. It creeps through soil, heaves shallow foundations, twists cabins out of square. A deep footing means the stone base will sit where the earth doesn't move, solid, predictable, able to carry not just log walls, but thousands of pounds of stone between them. Before we reveal the exact technique inside those walls, you need to see what he does with that trench. He hauls in riverstone first, setting the largest directly on bedrock. Faces tight, gaps packed with smaller shards. On top of that, courses of sandstone rise, one after another, mortared only by gravity and careful placement. No log touches soil. Every sill will rest on stone. That breaks the capillary path for moisture, slows rot, and creates a dense, continuous thermal reservoir right at the base of the cabin. From above, the footprint looks wrong. It's too wide. Jacob has laid it out to hold 2 full log walls with an 18-inch cavity between. Where his neighbor's cabins sit on neat, narrow ribbons of rock, his foundation sprawls, a massive stone rectangle that suggests a barn, a trading post, anything but a one-room shelter. Walls that'll never dry, Samuel Creek mutters, circling the site. You stack wood, that close, it'll mold, twist, crush itself. Those stones'll just hold the cold. He shakes his head as Jacob rolls the first log into place, seating it on that oversized stone base. The camera lingers. 1 man, 1 log. An absurdly wide foundation under a sky already whitening with early snow. Jacob doesn't answer. He just sets his axe, sights along the line of that double wall, and reaches for the next log, while Samuel walks away, confident he's just watched the warmest-looking failure in the valley begin. What happens when the first real cold hits those impossible walls is coming next. The next morning, the impossible walls stop being a line of chalk on stone and start becoming a fort. Jacob walks past the skinny lodgepole his neighbors favor and goes hunting for different trees, big ones, larger diameter trunks with tight, slow-grown grain from higher on the mountain, where the wind has already done half the selecting. These aren't pretty cabin logs. They're heavy, straight, and stubborn, chosen to shed weather and carry a roof that will be loaded with snow. Now, let's see what Jacob built when no one was watching. He drags each log to the foundation, sights along its length, and rejects anything with a twist. The outer wall, in his mind, isn't decoration. It's armor. This is the first surface that will meet the January wind at 40 miles an hour. If that line fails, nothing inside the cabin matters. Most cabins in the valley are rough work. Quick saddle notches, big visible gaps, moss and mud shoved in with a stick. Good enough until the thaw. Jacob goes further. He cuts deeper, cleaner notches, then spends long minutes shaving and refitting until the contact between logs is tight enough that daylight barely threads through. Every gap in this wall is a leak of heat, of comfort, of safety. So he treats each one like the difference between survival and catastrophe. Neighbors wander by and lean on fence rails that don't exist yet. They watch him fuss over a joint for half an hour and trade looks. Who wastes time on a wall that doesn't even count, when the real cabin is going inside? Before we reveal the exact technique hidden in that double line of logs, look at the way he finishes this outer skin. Jacob extends his roof logs farther than usual, throwing a simple overhang over the thick wall. No fancy trim. Just enough to push meltwater out and away. Along the eaves, he nails a crude drip edge from split boards. A little sacrificial lip that will rot long before the main wall ever drinks a full storm. He staggers every vertical joint, refusing to let two log ends line up above each other. That means there is no continuous vertical seam for wind to whistle through, no straight shot for rain to track down into the heart of the wall. From the outside, it looks chaotic. From the physics of air and water, it's disciplined. What did this stubborn mountain man understand? Laying that outer shell that 2 generations of frontiersmen had missed, that this wall doesn't need to feel warm on the inside. Its job is to stop motion of air, of moisture, of radiant cold, so the cavity behind it becomes a calm, protected microclimate where stone and inner logs can quietly manage the heat. By late autumn, the structure rising on his claim looks less like a homestead and more like a blockhouse. The outer wall stands thick and high, pierced by narrow openings, all business. Samuel rides past and calls it Reinhardt's jail. Another neighbor jokes he's building a trading post for a town that doesn't exist. They laugh because, from the road, you can't see the plan. You just see a fortress against the mountains. Inside that fortress, Jacob is about to start packing in 8,000 pounds of stone. That's when the real secret begins. Now, let's see what Jacob built when he stepped inside that fortress of outer logs. He doesn't start hauling stone yet. He starts another wall. Right there, inside the first cabin, he frames and stacks a second log wall, running parallel to the outer one, pulled in a consistent 18 inches. Not 12 here, 20 there, 18. All the way around, a clean, controlled gap that will soon be stone and trapped air, but for the moment looks like a strange, empty moat. To his neighbors, this confirms it. The man is wasting good timber on an interior fence. One of them jokes he's building a cabin inside his cabin because he plans to argue with himself all winter. But watch the details. The outer wall is rougher, heavier, meant to fight the wind and the cold. The inner wall Jacob builds with slightly smaller, smoother logs, carefully peeled. Easier to chink tight, easier to sweep with a hand, or lean your back against after a day in the mountains. This isn't just structure. This is the surface human skin is going to live against when the thermometer drops below zero. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about heat that 2 generations of frontiersmen had overlooked? He knew where people actually radiate warmth. He raises that inner wall with a plan in his head. From the floor to about 7 feet, the logs are dense, tight, and continuous. That band right there is the human heat zone. It's where you sit at the table, where you sleep on a bunk, where children sprawl on the floor near the stove. It's where your body throws off infrared like a little stove of its own. Above 7 feet, the wall still rises, but the critical mass and the stone fill will focus where the people are, not where the spiders live. Before we reveal the exact technique of how he loads that gap with stone, look at the geometry he refuses to compromise. No log on the inside lines up perfectly with a log on the outside. Seams are staggered, corners are reversed. There is no straight-through path where a single piece of wood can carry heat clean from the warm interior to the frozen exterior. Every potential thermal bridge is broken, forced to zigzag through wood, air, and soon, stone. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century hides in those offsets. Even modern builders fight the same enemy. Solid, uninterrupted paths that bleed heat all winter long. Stand with him now, inside that unfinished inner shell. The roof timbers arch overhead, the floor is still rough, and between you and the outer wall yawns that precise 18-inch gap. You can see daylight threading through the outer chinks, but you're standing inside another cabin, nested inside a protective shell. It feels wrong and ingenious at the same time. And once he fills that silent space between with 8,000 pounds of stone, it will become the difference between survival and catastrophe. Now, let's see what Jacob built when that empty gap stopped being theory and started being weight. He begins with the mountains themselves. Granite from a broken shoulder of the ridge, sandstone pried from low, honey-colored ledges along the creek. He hauls it in sled loads and hand barrows, boots grinding ruts between the outcrops and the cabin. The neighbors watch him pass, shaking their heads. Who drags half a hillside home just to bury it in a wall? But Jacob is picky. The heaviest granite, the pieces that make your arm shake after 20 yards, go to the lower courses, dense, reluctant to move, reluctant to change temperature. The slightly softer sandstone, easier to dress with a hammer and cold chisel, is reserved for where he needs tight fits and clean faces. What did this stubborn mountain man understand, weighing rocks in his hands, that his neighbors laughing on the porch did not? He starts at the foundation, inside that 18-inch cavity. First course, big flat stones, bedded like he's laying a dry stack wall, underground. Then another, and another, each stone tipped and twisted until it kisses its neighbors. No proud edges, no teetering points. He wants contact, as much contact as he can possibly get. Between those larger blocks, he feeds in smaller rock, fist-sized granite, broken sandstone wedges, even gravel scraped from the creek bed. Every void he can see, he attacks. Then he shovels in earth, screened, tamped, pushed deep with a stick so the soil flows into hairline gaps the stones can't fill. From the outside, it looks like rubble. From the inside, it's a single interlocked body of stone and earth climbing slowly up the wall. By 4 feet high, that cavity is a continuous ring of mass around the entire perimeter. No breaks at corners. No missing section behind the stove. He refuses to leave a light spot where heat can sprint past the stone and leak straight into the cold. In modern language, he's killing thermal bridges. In his language, he's just making sure the cold can't sneak around the heavy parts. Here's why the density obsession matters. A pound of granite or sandstone doesn't hold much more heat than a pound of wood. But cram 165 pounds of granite into the same volume as 30 pounds of pine, and the game changes. That ring of stone becomes a battery. When the stove roars all afternoon, the stone drinks in heat. When the fire dies at midnight, it bleeds that heat back, slow and steady, into the cabin. At least, that's the plan. Because if his read of the physics is wrong, if the earth stays damp, if the contact is poor, if the mass never truly warms, then he hasn't built a battery at all. He's built a giant cold sink, a refrigerated belt, wrapped around his cabin, ready to suck the heat out of every fire faster than his neighbor's simple log walls. And the first real Montana winter will expose which it is. Jacob knows the real danger isn't just a cold wall. It's a wall that secretly moves heat the wrong way. Above that heavy stone belt, from about 4 feet up to the eaves, the construction suddenly changes. The river rock stops. The double log walls keep climbing. And in between them, he leaves nothing. A deliberate hollow. And 1 8-inch gap of air that makes his neighbors shake their heads all over again. He ran out of stone, one of them mutters. Now he's just leaving holes. Now, let's see what Jacob built, because it is not a giant empty chute. It's a controlled void. A hidden blanket. He refuses the temptation to cram it full of random scraps the way most cabins in the mountains would have been insulated that winter. No loose bark, no old rags, no pile of damp sawdust, just waiting to rot. He wants air, but not moving air. This is the part almost no one on the frontier understood. Moving air is a thief. Still air is armor, so he breaks the gap into sections. Short horizontal braces span between the inner and outer logs every few feet. Not enough to bridge heat like a solid plank wall, but enough to slice that tall cavity into smaller pockets. He blocks off direct vertical runs at the corners. He seals the top where the wall meets the roof plate, and the bottom where the stone core ends, so air can't quietly rise on the warm side, dump its heat, and slide back down on the cold side, because that would create a ghost chimney inside the wall, a convective loop you'd never see, but you'd feel every time the fire died. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that 2 generations of cabin builders kept missing? He's copying something you already own. A down jacket does not work because of feathers. It works because those feathers trap millions of tiny still air pockets. A double-pane window is just 2 sheets of glass with a thin sealed layer of air or gas between them. The material isn't magic. The stillness is. Before we reveal the exact technique he uses to fine-tune that stillness, notice what he refuses to do. He never lets the interior air leak into that cavity. No gaps in the inner wall. No casual drill holes for drying. If warm room air could sneak in, rise, and escape higher up, that elegant thermal battery of stone would be harnessed to a pump, constantly throwing heat away. He does experiment. In a few sections, especially on the north wall where the wind cuts hardest, he lightly packs dry moss and clean straw between the braces, not jammed tight from bottom to top, but in broken layers, like primitive bats, enough to slow any tiny eddies, not enough to connect the inside of the cabin to that hidden space. The rule is simple. The air can be divided, but it cannot be allowed to circulate. Get this wrong, and the whole design flips. A continuous open gap from sill to eave would turn his proud double wall into the worst kind of radiator, a silent siphon pulling warm air upward and bleeding it into the cold night. In a mild climate, that's a nuisance. In a Montana January, that can be the difference between survival and catastrophe. And the first real blizzard will tell him brutally whether he's built a shield or a chimney. The first place that blizzard will probe isn't the fancy double wall. It's the holes Jacob cut in it. Windows, doors, all the weak spots the wind loves. Standard Montana cabins in 1876 wore their windows like trophies, big panes on the south, a token one on the east, sometimes even a north window if you were feeling rich or reckless. Light was life in a long winter. But every square foot of glass was a thin invitation for the cold to walk in and sit by your fire. Jacob looked at that equation and walked away from it. He gave himself exactly 2 windows, both small, both on the south side, each one no wider than a man's shoulders and shorter than his forearm. To his neighbors, it looked like he was building a root cellar with delusions of grandeur. "You planning to live in there, Reinhardt, or just store potatoes?" one of them asked. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that they didn't? Now, let's see what Jacob built around those openings. He refused to punch clean holes straight through his double wall. Instead, each window sat deep in the cavity, recessed like a gun embrasure in a stone fort. From the inside, you'd see a thick, tunnel-like sill, wood and stone wrapping around the glass on all 4 sides. The actual pane was closer to the warm inner wall than the freezing outer one, protected from the coldest surface and the sharpest wind. That depth mattered. Glass radiates heat to the night sky. A shallow window bleeds warmth like a bare hand on an iron stove lid. A deep-set window, buried in a thick throat of wood and stone, sees less of that cold sky and more of the warm interior. The tunnel edges catch and temper the air, slowing convection so the window becomes a controlled leak instead of an open wound. The door was treated with the same suspicion. He built it heavy, thick planks laid crosswise over a second layer, like a wooden sandwich with a thin air gap trapped inside. The frame had overlapping stops, so when the door closed, it didn't just meet the jamb. It bit into it, wood overlapping wood, killing the line-of-sight path for wind. No straight crack for that January air to knife through. And then he did something that, to frontier eyes, bordered on absurd. He gave his tiny cabin an even tinier annex. A shallow entry space, barely large enough to stand and hang a coat, a cold porch, a windbreak. You opened one door to step into that buffer, then a second door into the warm core. It was the poor man's airlock, built not from theory, but from memories of stone farmhouses in the old country. The trade-off was brutal. Inside, Jacob's cabin felt darker than his neighbors' places. No wide, sun-washed views of the mountains. At midday, the light pooled in narrow bands on the floor, leaving corners in permanent dusk. The jokes came easy. Reinhardt's dug himself a bunker, they said. Hope the Indians appreciate the lack of target practice. But Jacob wasn't chasing views. He was chasing control of heat. From the outside, the result looked wrong. The cabin sat squat and thick on its stone foundation, under-windowed and overbuilt, more like a storage vault than a family home. To a passerby, judging by appearance alone, it was a mistake nailed together from too many logs and too few panes. Before we reveal the exact technique that would make that mistake outperform every pretty cabin on the ridge, we need to see what happens when the first real cold slams into those tiny openings and that strange double wall at the same time. The first hard cold comes in sideways. Wind off the Bridger Mountains, snow like thrown sand, air knifing through the gaps of every normal cabin on the ridge. Neighbors stomp and curse by their stoves, watching frost creep across interior log faces. Heat in, heat out. Firewood vanishing up a straight iron pipe. Jacob does something that, to them, looks even dumber than his double wall. He drags his heavy iron stove off the exterior wall and plants it almost in the center of the cabin. In 1876, that was heresy. Stoves went against outside walls, so the pipe could shoot straight up and out. Less work, less thinking. But Jacob is not trying to save effort. He is trying to bend heat. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about winter that 2 generations of frontiersmen had ignored? Now, let's see what Jacob built around that stove. The firebox faces not toward a window, not toward the outer logs, but toward the densest run of his inner wall. He has lined that section with the thickest stones, packed tight in the cavity. When that stove door glows red, its main radiant view is straight into thousands of pounds of rock. Iron to stone, stone to air, air to skin. You can picture it. Sit in Jacob's cabin on a clear January night, and you can feel the difference. The front of your body takes the sharp, direct heat from the stove. A moment later, the wall behind you begins to warm. Then the bench, then the floor along that central line. The cabin is not just warm. It is charging. Most men in the valley run a fire all day, wide open, trying to chase the cold away. Jacob does the opposite. Short, hot burns. Dampers set to get that iron stove almost angry, then shut down. He watches the stones instead of the flames. How long do they stay warm to the touch? How many hours until the inner wall stops giving back heat? Before we reveal the exact technique he used to measure that coast time, look at his stovepipe. It does not punch straight through the nearest log. It runs horizontal first, then angles up, snaking through the room before it finally exits high in the gable. Every extra foot of black pipe is another radiator, bleeding heat into the cabin and into that stone-filled cavity instead of surrendering it to the sky. Neighbors joke that he built a chimney maze. Jacob calls it free fuel. This is knowledge that's been buried for over a century. Use the fire to charge mass, then live off the release. He has, without the words, turned his entire cabin into a thermal battery. In mild cold, it works. But when the real Arctic air drops in February, when the mercury hides and the wind howls for days, will that battery still hold the difference between survival and catastrophe? The first real test isn't the temperature. It's the experts. Word spreads through the mountains that Jacob has turned his cabin walls into a stone bin. Not just neighbors now. Men who know cabins. Men who have built through 20 winters they come to look and to laugh. Samuel Creek is the first to walk the line. Old trapper, 30 years in Montana territory, the man everyone asks when a roof sags. He steps inside the half-finished shell, runs his hand along the inner log wall, then raps his knuckles against it. The sound is dull, deadened by 8,000 pounds of riverstone on the other side. He frowns, taps again, harder. Hear that? That gap's going to stay damp and cold, he says, turning so the others can hear every word. You've built yourself a sponge for frost. It'll suck the heat right out of you. To men raised on single-wall cabins, that makes perfect sense. Air gaps mean drafts. Stone means cold. You can feel the agreement in the room. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about heat that Creek did not? At this moment, to everyone present, the answer is nothing. William Thorpe, who sells sawn lumber to half the valley, circles the cabin like a man inspecting a bad horse. He counts courses of logs, squints at the double wall, then snorts. You wasted twice the timber for the same floor space, he announces. Double work for half the cents. He jabs a finger at the gap line. You boys see this? Don't copy him. You built a castle to freeze in, Jacob. There's a little laugh at that. Not cruel, just confident. This is how knowledge that's been buried for over a century stays buried. The man with the ledger in the sawmill says it's foolish, and the valley nods. Then Thomas Berkner shows up, former army carpenter. The one man in the valley who has actually read an engineering manual. If anyone is going to defend Jacob on technical grounds, it would be him. He doesn't. Brickner runs a hand along the sill, peers into the unfilled sections of the cavity, and starts ticking off problems like a quartermaster. You trap moisture in here, these inner logs rot where you can't see it, he says. You get ants or beetle in that cavity, you won't know until the wall shifts. Any settlement in the stone, you'll open gaps and never find them. You'll be burning twice the wood just to warm all that rock. He looks Jacob dead in the eye. There's a reason cabins aren't built this way. Now, let's see what Jacob built in response to that chorus of certainty. He doesn't argue. He doesn't quote numbers about thermal mass or talk about the difference between survival and catastrophe when the real winter comes. He just bends, picks up another sandstone block, and dents it in lime and clay between the walls. He seals every joint he can reach, day after day while the experts predict failure. He keeps stacking stone, quietly betting that the only judge that matters is the first true Arctic night. Now, let's see what Jacob built when the last stone went in and the mud on his hands finally dried. It looked wrong. The walls were so thick the windows shrank into the logs like arrow slits in a frontier blockhouse. The roofline rode low and heavy on that mass of timber and stone, more like a squat fort pressed into the hillside than a homestead in the Montana mountains. Next to the lighter, single-wall cabins, it looked overbuilt, almost defensive. It sat heavier on the land than its neighbors. You could see the stone base standing proud above the frozen ground, a band of gray and rust-red rock lifting the logs out of the soil. When the first snows came, drifts piled waist-deep against those thick sides, climbing halfway up the window openings. In other cabins, that much snow meant damp sills, weeping corners, and a creeping chill through every gap. Here the snow just pressed against the outer wall and stopped. No visible sag. No dark stains, no smoke curling harder from the chimney as someone stoked the fire in panic. But there was a cost, and everyone could see it. With that double wall and stone core, Jacob lost interior floor space for the same outer footprint. Step inside, and the room felt narrower, the corners closer. Fewer windows meant less light, and those deep reveals turned every pane into a tunnel of shadow. Midday, his cabin looked dim compared to the bright, drafty rooms his neighbors had built. To a frontier eye, raised on the idea that more openings meant more comfort, it seemed cramped, maybe even a little oppressive. Who wants to spend a long winter in a wooden bunker? The settlement answered that question for him. Kids dared each other to run up and knock on the fort, then sprint away before the strange German opened the door. Men at the mill shook their heads and predicted that all that stone would sweat and drip. Too damp, too dark, too odd, they said. Women passing on the trail whispered that no healthy child could grow up without real daylight. One neighbor joked that Jacob had built a root cellar and forgotten to put it underground. Before we reveal the exact technique hiding in those walls, you need to understand how radical this looked in a place where every swing of an axe counted. In a world where labor and materials were precious, anything that looked like extra was branded wasteful. Extra thickness, extra stone, extra time cutting a second line of notches. Jacob's cabin violated that unwritten law so completely it became a local joke, a cautionary tale told over coffee about what happens when a man reads too many foreign books. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about heat and cold that they did not? To them, those massive walls were an indulgence. To him, in the teeth of a Montana winter, they might be the difference between survival and catastrophe. The punchline would have to wait for the first true blizzard. The punchline did not have to wait long. By late autumn, the cabin was finished. The double walls were packed tight with stone. The roof shook tight. Shelves lined with flour, beans, and coffee. Out in the Bridger Mountains, November 1876 came in wrong. The river took on a skim of ice before All Saints' Day and then kept going. By the second week, the ice was thick enough to hold a man and his axe. That was not normal. Old trappers started using old phrases, a 40-year winter, the kind of cold you only hear about from men whose hands never quite thaw out. Before we reveal the exact technique that made Jacob so calm, you have to see what everyone else was seeing. Reports drifted in with the traders' wagons. Early freezes up toward the mussel shell. Elk herds moving low and early, hugging the timber as if they knew something. One Crow scout told a buffalo turning back from the high plains weeks ahead of their usual path. To men who lived by patterns in the mountains, those were alarms. You read those signs wrong. You paid in fingers and toes. The neighbors responded the way frontier wisdom always had. More of the same. They cut extra cords of pine and fir, stacking ragged pyramids behind single-wall cabins. They went back over their log seams, ramming moss and mud into every visible crack. Old quilts and gunny sacks got nailed around windows. Wool blankets hung over doors, so you had to shoulder your way in like a horse through a canvas flap. And as they worked, they joked. Of course they did. One man called Jacob's place a stone-lined coffin. Another said, loud enough for everyone to hear, that Jacob would find out what cold really is once that big thermal battery of his sucked the heat out of his own fire. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century tends to look like madness the first time it walks back into town. Jacob just kept preparing his experiment. Now, let's see what Jacob built as a test, not just a cabin. He drove an iron nail into an inner post and hung a simple alcohol thermometer where he could read it from his bunk. He marked a notch on the wall for a second one near the floor. He counted his wood, measured stacks, each half cord, each log roughly the same length. He planned to track how much he burned in a week, not by guesswork, but by empty space in the woodpile. He paid attention to comfort the way a machinist watches tolerances. Could he sleep without his coat? Did his breath frost in the air before dawn? Was there rime forming on the inner logs, on the tiny panes of glass, on the stone itself? Those would be his metrics. Interior temperature, wood consumed, frost or no frost, the feel of the air on his face at 3 a.m. Outside, the sky lowered. The first real blizzard announced itself with a wind that did not gust. It pressed. The light went from gray to white, then to nothing at all. Snow came sideways, grains of ice stinging exposed skin. One by one, doors in the little settlement slammed, blankets dropped over entries, fires were stoked hard. Jacob swung his thick door shut, the double wall swallowing the sound of the wind to a distant roar. As the latch dropped, no one out there realized they had just stepped into a controlled trial and that this wrong cabin was about to start writing numbers no one expected. Outside, the storm hit its stride. Wind didn't just blow, it screamed. Gusts knifed down from the Bridger Mountains, slamming into the cabin so hard the log walls flexed with a dull wooden groan. Snow came sideways, grains of ice hitting the outer walls like thrown sand, rattling shutters, hissing under door sills, finding every careless gap the settlers had left. In the distance, through that white roar, something else spoke. Trees. You could hear them crack, a sharp report, like distant gunfire, as sap-frozen trunks twisted and snapped in the brutal cold. Thermometers nailed to porch posts plunged well below zero, their thin red lines sinking toward minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, dragged down by a wind chill flirting with minus 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Cut to the neighbor's cabin. Inside, the iron stove roared bright orange, the kind of fire you feed with panic. Boots steamed in a circle, wet wool smoked, the family huddled close, faces flushed, hands almost too hot to the touch. But step 3 paces back from that glowing door, and the truth showed up. The far corners were dim and cold. Breath fogged in the air near the single-pane window. Frost traced delicate white fingers along the floorboards where icy air leaked through the sill. A cheap tin thermometer on the back wall read 65 degrees Fahrenheit at 9 p.m. Not bad, they told themselves. This was winter. This was normal. You burned hard. You slept in layers. You dreaded the moment the fire died down. One neighbor joked that if you rolled out of bed without your boots, you'd leave skin on the floor. They banked the fire as best they could, piled on quilts, and lay there listening for the stove to stop ticking, listening for the heat to drain away. Because in a standard single-wall log cabin, it always did. Now, let's see what Jacob built. Same storm, same night, same outside temperature. different rhythm. Jacob's evening fire was strong, but not frantic. He fed it steady through supper, letting the flames lick against iron and radiate into that inner log wall lined with 8,000 pounds of stone. You could put your palm on the interior wall and feel it, not scorching, but deeply, calmly warm, like a sleeping animal that had been quietly eating heat all day. Before we reveal the exact technique in diagrams and numbers, watch the numbers that mattered to Jacob. On his table, another simple thermometer. As his fire settled to coals near midnight, it held around 68 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. No frantic last-minute log toss. No midnight sprint for more kindling. Across the way hours later, the neighbor's thermometer told a different story. With the stove gone to ash, the reading sagged from that hopeful 65 degrees Fahrenheit toward 40, then 38, then near 36 degrees Fahrenheit by early morning. The walls, open paths of cold, bled heat into the night. Jacob's cabin? Those stone-charged walls released their stored warmth slow and stubborn. Through the small hours, his air stayed in the high 60s, low 70s, drifting down only a few degrees. As the coals dimmed, what did this stubborn mountain man understand that 2 generations of frontiersmen had missed about where heat should live in a cabin? Sometime near dawn, Jacob woke briefly. No wind howled in his ears. The double wall had turned that rage into a distant murmur. He reached out from his bed, laid his hand on the inner wall. It still radiated a gentle, even heat, like sun-warmed stone long after sunset. He did something his neighbors would have called reckless. He did not rise. He did not stoke the fire. In a Montana winter that could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe, he simply rolled over and went back to sleep, while outside, the storm kept trying and failing to break in. Morning did not so much dawn as grind in. Gray light seeped through ice-rimmed windows up and down the draw. One cabin door creaked, then another. Men and women stepped out, shoulders hunched, faces drawn, eyes ringed from a night of half-sleep and constant tending of fires that never quite caught up to the cold. This was normal. This was frontier winter. They slapped frozen blankets on the porch rail, hard frost breaking off in white flakes. Someone cursed at a water bucket, solid as stone. Another neighbor held up a tin dipper that had frozen to the rim. Breath smoked in the air, and so did the complaints. Could see my breath all night. Frost on the inside of the rafters again. Stove ate half a cord and still woke up shivering. Down the line, Samuel Creek stood on his stoop, rubbing eyes that felt full of sand. He'd been up every 2 hours, feeding his iron box stove like it was a starving animal. The cabin had still sunk to the high 30s by dawn. His youngest had coughed all night. His wife's hair had frozen to the wall logs where her head brushed them. He looked toward Jacob's place up the slight rise. No smoke, not a thread from the chimney. In a Montana cold snap, that wasn't just odd. That was a problem. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about heat that 2 generations of frontiersmen had overlooked? Or, Samuel thought grimly, had he simply frozen in his backwoods cabin while everyone else was at least alive to complain? He pulled on his coat, snow crunching under worn boots, and trudged up through the drifts. The wind knifed down off the mountains, finding every gap in his scarf, reminding him exactly how thin log walls could feel when the mercury fell. As he climbed, he rehearsed the scene he expected. Jacob huddled by a dying fire, breath fogging, maybe sick, maybe worse. He rapped on the door with a mittened fist. No answer. He knocked again, harder. The latch lifted. The door opened 6 inches, then all the way, and a visible wave of warmer air hit Samuel in the face like he'd stepped off a train into another climate. His glasses fogged instantly. His beard flashed white with condensed moisture. He froze in the doorway. Inside, Jacob stood in shirt sleeves. No hat, no coat, just a worn wool shirt and suspenders. Steam curling off a tin mug in his hand like this was late September. Not a morning that had driven frost through every crack in the valley. Samuel blinked, wiped his lenses with a shaking thumb, and stepped in. No frost lacing the inside of the window panes. No ghostly rime tracing the gaps between logs. He reached out, almost on instinct, and laid his palm against the inner wall. Warm. Not scalding, not stove hot. Just calmly warm, like sunlit stone after noon. The floor didn't bite through his socks. The air didn't sting his lungs. In the corner, the stove door sat half open, revealing nothing more than a small bed of coals, red like a resting animal, not a roaring iron beast devouring a forest. He turned slowly, trying to find the trick. A hidden flue? Extra stove? Some secret Jacob had smuggled from the old country? "Jacob," he said, voice catching between accusation and awe. "How is it this warm in here?" Jacob shrugged, as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. "Walls are doing their share," he said. "Before we reveal the exact technique, pause on that line. In a winter where the difference between survival and catastrophe was measured in degrees, what did this stubborn mountain man understand, and what was hiding inside those walls that even his closest neighbors had never seen? Now, let's see what Jacob built. Now, let's see what Jacob built actually do its work." The proof didn't show up in a single blizzard. It showed up in the slow, grinding arithmetic of a Montana winter. Week 1, nobody notices. Every cabin is burning hot, smoke pouring from stovepipes, men swaggering about whose pile of larch and pine is tallest. Week 3, though, when the cold settles in and doesn't leave, the numbers start whispering a different story. Jacob's woodpile is the first insult. Same mountains, same trees, same saws and axes. But while his neighbor's cords shrink like snowbanks in a Chinook, his stack hardly seems to move, a few inches gone where others have lost feet. One man jokes that Jacob must be sneaking over at night and stealing from their piles. Another laughs that his crazy double wall is probably hiding a second stove. The mockery is easy, until the thermometers come out. This is where the frontier turns into a laboratory. One neighbor, Anders, doesn't trust his own senses. He trudges over one dawn in late January, breath freezing in his beard, carrying a second mercury thermometer from his cabin. No wind. Sky hard and clear. The outside air is sitting around minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit. His own place, with the fire gone out 3 hours earlier, is clinging to the low 40s inside. You can see your breath in his front room. He hangs one thermometer on Jacob's inner log wall, sets the other on a small shelf near the bed, waits in his coat. The stove in Jacob's cabin is only coals. No roaring blaze, no frantic feeding. After 10 minutes, both glass columns settle. 67 bare feet on plank floor. No visible breath. The man just stares. What did the stubborn mountain man understand about heat that 2 generations of frontiersmen had ignored? By the first week of February, the anecdote becomes evidence. Families in standard single-wall cabins have burned through nearly their entire winter's wood. Some are down to twisted branches, green rounds that hiss in the firebox, and the emergency stack they swore they'd never touch. They are living at 38 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit, indoors, without an active fire, wrapped in coats at the table. Jacob, with his stone-filled wall, still has a substantial, squared-off stack standing like a quiet accusation beside his cabin. Pride does not like arithmetic. Around the stove in the trading post, the tone shifts. The loudest critics get sharper, more defensive. They insist Jacob must be cheating the scale, or that his cabin is just small and tight, and that's all there is to it. But others start asking quieter questions. How deep is your foundation, Jacob? How high did you run that stone? How wide is the gap in that wall? Knowledge that's been buried for over a century is, in that moment, walking around in boots and wool. What they are living through is a real-world A/B test. Same climate, same fuel, same brutal winter. The only real variable is the wall design. On one side, the proven frontier method, hemorrhaging heat and wood. On the other, a dense thermal mass core that turns every hour of fire into stored warmth. The results are too stark to ignore. And the next question is inevitable. How exactly did he do it? So why did this wrong cabin work so outrageously well? Why did Jacob sit in shirt sleeves at 68 degrees Fahrenheit while his neighbors were stomping their boots in 38 degrees Fahrenheit living rooms, feeding their stoves like coal mines? To answer that, you have to zoom out from the drama and look at the invisible thing that ruled that winter: heat flow. Now, let's see what Jacob built in terms of physics, not rumor. There are only 3 ways heat can escape a cabin: conduction, convection, and radiation. The outer log wall was his shield against radiation and wind. It faced the howling Bridger Mountains, took the snow load, and cut the radiant view of the minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit night sky. That alone slowed radiative loss. But inside that, a second wall, a stone core, and an air gap that turned those same walls into active players, not just passive barriers. Conduction is heat sneaking through solids. In a normal single-wall cabin, the logs are one continuous bridge from inside to outside. Warm interior surface, cold exterior surface, one direct path. In Jacob's design, there was no single solid path. Inner wood, then stone, then air, then outer wood. Each change in material forced the heat to cross a boundary, like toll booths on a mountain road. Every boundary added resistance and bought him time. Convection is moving air carrying heat away. His neighbors' cabins leaked, so warm air rushed out and cold air rushed in, setting up big convective loops inside the walls and between gaps. Jacob's stone-filled cavity shut that down. The stone was packed tight, with only thin films of air between pieces. That meant almost no room for big air currents to form. Above the stone, he left a broken-up, sealed air gap. Not a big chimney. A series of dead pockets. Those pockets acted like a still blanket, nearly as effective as insulation, stopping convective loops before they could steal his warmth. Then there's radiation from warm surfaces to cold ones. The inner wall and the exposed stone surface facing the cabin absorbed radiant heat from the stove and from Jacob himself. This is where the thermal flywheel came in. Stone doesn't just get hot and dump its heat instantly. It charges. Over hours of firing, those 8,000 pounds of river stone and sandstone soaked up excess heat that would have made the cabin stifling. When the fire went out, that same stone released heat slowly, keeping the room in the mid-50s by morning. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that his neighbors, with their drafty cabins and endless firewood runs, completely missed? No major thermal bridges, no direct log highway from inside to outside, just a thick, layered sandwich where every inch forced heat to slow down, store up, and then leak back into the living space on Jacob's terms, not the wind's. Before we reveal the exact technique you can copy on your own walls, remember this. In a brutal winter, the difference between survival and catastrophe often comes down to who controls the heat and who lets it escape. So let's pull the wall apart for a second and name what's really going on, because this is where most cabins go wrong. People mix up two different weapons in the fight against cold: thermal mass and insulation. Thermal mass is weight with a memory. Stone, thick wood, earth. You pour heat into it, it soaks that heat up, then it slowly leaks it back out over hours. Insulation is different. Insulation does not store much heat at all. It just slows the flow, like a traffic jam in the wall, keeping the warmth from racing out into the Montana night. A good winter wall? It needs both. Something heavy to store and something fluffy or still to resist flow. When you only have mass, the cabin can feel like a stone cellar. When you only have insulation, it warms fast but cools just as fast once the fire dies. Now, let's see what Jacob built. His double log wall, packed with nearly 8,000 pounds of river stone and sandstone, leans hard toward mass. Those inner stones are the thermal battery. The outer logs, the inner logs, and the thin films of trapped air between rough surfaces are the modest insulation that keeps that battery from bleeding straight to the snow. In a place like the Bridger Mountains, where winter locks in and the fire is burning day after day, that balance is brutal and effective. The mass stays charged. The indoor temperature barely swings, while his neighbors chase the thermostat from freezing to roasting and back again. Jacob's cabin moved like a slow tide of warmth. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that the others missed? He was designing for sustained cold and continuous heating, not for comfort on a mild April afternoon. His walls were tuned to a season, not a single day. But that same strength hides a weakness. Imagine this cabin dropped into a milder valley with big day-night swings, warm sun at noon, frost by dawn. or picture you arriving late on a Friday night, lighting a fire in a cabin that's been cold for a week. All that stone is now a heat sink. It drinks the first several hours of fire, and you sit there wondering why the room feels sluggish while the walls quietly load up. There's another trade most modern builders would question. Jacob's cabin is dark, small windows, heavy overhangs, dark interior surfaces. He sacrificed daylight and some psychological comfort for pure thermal performance. In 1876, that was an easy decision. In a world with cheap glass and LED lights, you might not be so eager to live in a permanent, late-evening gloom just to shave a few armloads of firewood. Here's the real lesson, and it's not copy this exact cabin. It's to understand how mass and air gaps can work together so you can adapt the idea intelligently to your own climate, your own schedule, your own mountains. Because once you see that, you can bend the rules Jacob used, and in the next segment, we'll push his wall in a way that would have shocked even him. And here's where Jacob's wrong-looking cabin stops being an isolated frontier fluke and starts looking like a pattern. Because if you zoom out from those Montana mountains and jump a few thousand miles east, you find his hidden cousins, Scandinavia. Long winters, short days, wet cold that crawls into your bones. Traditional log houses there started as the same single-wall cabins Jacob's neighbors trusted. Heavy timber, tight notches, chinked gaps, big fire. That was the way. Until a few builders did something that looked ridiculous. They built a second wall on the inside. Not thicker logs. A light inner liner wall, plank or frame, set a few inches in from the main logs and left with a deliberate air gap. To the old-timers, it looked wasteful. Why build two walls when one good wall should do? But that thin, still layer of air turned out to be a quiet weapon. It cut drafts, tamed radiant cold from the outer logs, and suddenly those dark December nights felt less brutal. Less frost on the inside of the cabin, less firewood burned to stay warm. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about heat that those Norse builders had also stumbled into? That air, if you trap it and control it, is insulation. That comfort in deep winter is about slowing the movement of heat, not just throwing more fuel at the problem. Now drop back across the Atlantic a century later into another cabin that looked wrong. A trapper shack on the Canadian Shield, minus 30 degrees Celsius outside, weeks of sub-zero cold. He framed double stud walls, outer and inner, then packed the entire cavity with sawdust and wood shavings from the mill. To visiting neighbors, it was a joke. You're living in a tinderbox. One spark and you're done. But night after night, that tiny iron stove on the floor glowed at half throttle, while the room stayed warm enough to work barehanded. Why? Because those double walls held an enormous volume of trapped, nearly still air between the flakes of sawdust. Low density, low conductivity, almost no convection paths. Heat moved slowly, so the cabin cooled slowly. Look at these three cabins side by side in your mind. Jacob's stone core, the Scandinavian liner wall, the sawdust trapper shack. Different materials, same move. Double layers, controlled air. Wrong to the eye, right to the thermometer. Fast forward again to a modern off-grid builder in the Rockies. He ignores the standard sheathing insulation drywall recipe and builds a wrong-way wall. Vertical boards outside, horizontal boards inside, with a vented cavity between them. Carpenters laugh. Water will pour in, heat will pour out, they say. Except it doesn't. The vertical exterior drains and dries. The vented gap dumps moisture before it can condense. The horizontal inner boards, backed by a calm airspace, sit near room temperature. In midwinter, with a modest heater, that cabin stays dry and surprisingly warm. Before we reveal the exact technique Jacob used, notice the common thread. Each of these builders was mocked for doing something that looked inefficient, backwards, even dangerous. Yet performance under real winter cold turned the insults into questions. This is knowledge that's been buried for over a century. The best cold weather cabins often come from people willing to ignore appearances and focus on how heat actually moves. Get the mass where it matters. Trap air where it helps. Break the straight paths from warm inside to cold outside. That difference between survival and catastrophe in a frontier winter, it's often hiding in a wall that looks wrong until the storm hits. In the next segment, we'll take that principle and twist Jacob's idea even further into a wall he never saw, but you can build. So what does that actually look like if you're standing in your driveway right now, staring at a bare patch of dirt and thinking, could I build a Jacob wall today? You can. But you won't be stacking hand-hewn logs and river stone like a 19th century hermit in the mountains. Now, let's see what Jacob built, translated into modern tools and codes. His double log wall becomes, for you, a double stud frame, 2 parallel rows of studs maybe, 2x4s, 10 to 12 inches apart. The outer frame carries your siding and sheathing, the inner frame carries your drywall and electrical. In between, a deep cavity of insulation with almost no solid wood connecting inside to out. You've just killed the straight thermal bridge that bleeds heat in a normal cabin wall. Don't want double studs? You can flip the idea. One sturdy structural frame, exterior insulated sheathing wrapped in rigid foam or mineral wool, then an interior mass wall. That could be a thin brick veneer, a block wall, even compressed earth blocks anchored to the inside. Light frame outside, heavy inside. The cold stays at the sheathing. The heat lives on, the room side where you can feel it. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that still applies here? Put the weight where you live. Jacob buried his stone inside the envelope. You can recreate that thermal mass band without hauling 8,000 pounds of river rock, a low stone or brick knee wall around the perimeter at chair height, a row of compressed earth blocks behind your wood stove, even water barrels, painted dark, lined up along an interior wall in a workshop, dense, continuous, and exposed to the room, so they drink in heat all day and bleed it back into the night. Before we reveal the exact technique for controlling that crucial air gap, remember, air is only insulation when it's still. Jacob's cavity let heat move into the stone without turning into a chimney. You do the same with baffles and blocking. In a double stud wall, you stop vertical races by staggering blocks, dense packing cellulose, and sealing the top and bottom plates so air can't just sprint from floor to attic. You want slow, lazy convection against the mass, not a hidden wind tunnel. This is where modern moisture knowledge, the kind of knowledge that's been buried for over a century of quick builds, saves you from the rot Jacob's neighbors warned him about. Outside, a rain screen gap behind your siding lets bulk water drain and your wall dry. Inside, you use a smart vapor retarder instead of plastic, so the wall can dry both directions when seasons flip. Breathable materials, mineral wool, cellulose, wood fiber, hold and release moisture without feeding mold. Do you have to copy a log-and-stone relic to beat the cold? Not at all. You borrow the principles, mass where you live, air where you insulate, minimal thermal bridges from warm inside to cold outside. That difference between survival and catastrophe Jacob proved with a blizzard and a bet? In the next segment, we push it one step further, into a wall that doesn't just hold heat, but harvests it. So let's bring Jacob's gamble straight into your living room. Imagine this winter, your firewood pile, your propane delivery, or your heating budget is suddenly cut in half. Not next year, next week. The temperature drops, the wind comes off the mountains, and you get 1 weekend to change your cabin or house before the real cold hits. Where do you go first? With a hammer in your hand. Most people point straight up. More insulation in the attic. And yes, that helps. But in a small cabin, in a trailer, in a tight little house on a slab, the real traders are almost always sideways. The walls, the corners, the tiny gaps where warm indoor air is quietly leaking its life into the cold. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that most modern homeowners still ignore? That once you tame the roof, the next big leak is through continuous solid paths from warm inside to cold outside. Thermal bridges, a steel beam running through your wall, a concrete slab edge that never got insulated, a neat, perfectly aligned row of studs that punches straight through your fluffy insulation like wooden radiator fins. Before we reveal the exact technique Jacob used, pause and look around your own place. Where does metal pierce from inside to outside. Where does that cold mine show up in the drywall on a January morning? Window frames with aluminum cladding, electrical boxes that whistle in a windstorm. The corner where two exterior walls meet, and the paint always feels just a little colder to the touch. Think of a trapper's cabin with double stud walls packed with sawdust, or a Scandinavian house with an inner liner wall and an air gap that let them ride out -30 winters with a tiny stove. They didn't win by throwing more fuel at the problem. They won by cutting the invisible highways where heat escaped. Now, let's see what Jacob built as a mental template. He thickened the wall where he actually lived. He accepted a cabin that looked wrong to his neighbors in exchange for a room that stayed warm when their fires died. If your heat were cut in half, would you do the same? Would you live with thicker interior walls that steal a few inches from the room, smaller windows that frame less view but leak less cold, or a heavy interior wall of stone or brick that soaks up heat like a battery for a blackout week? This is where the question stops being academic. Would you rather have magazine perfect glass and elegant exposed beams, or a slightly awkward overbuilt corner that stays at 60 degrees Fahrenheit when the grid fails for 7 days? In the comments, share the strangest or smartest insulation or thermal mass trick you've seen in a cabin, tiny home, or off-grid build. Sawdust walls, earth-burned bunkers, stone floors under stoves. Because in the next segment, we test one of the weirdest ideas of all. A wall that looks like a design mistake, yet might outperform Jacob's in the dead of winter. But here's the twist. Almost nobody on that mountain understood. Most of the misery in a small cabin doesn't leak through the center of the wall. It leaks around it, at the corners, around the windows, right where the wall meets the foundation, at the sill plate. That's where the invisible winter lives. Standard frontier cabins were a draft machine, logs notched in a hurry, corners that moved as the wood shrank, crude window openings with a bit of moss jammed in for good measure, and a sill log hanging out in the wind like a cold radiator. The R value on paper didn't matter when the wind could whistle straight through the joints and steal heat faster than the fire could make it. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that his neighbors didn't? He understood that air is the real thief. Not just the cold, moving air, convection, tiny pressure differences in a blizzard pulling warm air out of a cabin and ramming cold air back in through every gap you didn't see. Now, let's see what Jacob built without ever using those words. His double wall meant the inner logs and outer logs were staggered, not one continuous path of wood to the outside, fewer direct cracks, fewer straight shots for wind. Between them, 8,000 pounds of stone pushing down, pressing joints tight, loading that sill and foundation so everything stayed seated. Heavy materials don't just store heat. They clamp the cabin together, and that stone base, it lifted the vulnerable wood sill out of the direct blast of cold air. Instead of a frosty wind licking at a thin edge of timber, the bottom of the wall met a thick, dense, slow-to-change mass. The temperature swing at that joint flattened out, less expansion, less contraction, fewer gaps opening as the mercury dropped. In 2025, people still repeat the same mistake as Jacob's neighbors. They add thicker insulation, then ignore the air leaks. They double the R value, then skip the corners. Before we reveal the exact technique of that wrong modern wall, look at what you can do right now. Modern gasket under your sill plate so air can't sneak between wood and concrete. Careful caulking or high-quality tape at every corner joint, inside and out, so the wind has to fight for every inch. Proper window flashing so meltwater and air don't share the same shortcut. A continuous interior air barrier, paint-on membrane, taped sheathing, or smart vapor retarder, so drafts die before they ever reach the room. These moves often cost less than 1 extra inch of insulation, yet they deliver more comfort, more stable temperatures, and a cabin that feels warm with a smaller fire. That's knowledge that's been buried for over a century, hiding in Jacob's walls. So here's your mental checklist. Stand in your own space and ask, where are my corners leaking? How is my sill meeting the foundation? What did this stubborn mountain man understand about air that I'm still ignoring? Because the difference between survival and catastrophe in a long winter can be hiding in a gap you've never even looked at. Now zoom out from that drafty sill and look at the whole wall, because out in the modern world, The battle lines against the cold look very different from Jacob's mountainside cabin, at least on paper. Today, the standard play is light and fluffy. Fiberglass bats squeezed between studs, stapled in place, covered with drywall. It gives you a clean R value. It's cheap, it's fast. Builders love it, but press on it wrong, leave a gap, cram it behind an outlet box, and its performance collapses. Air sneaks through, convection loops form, and the wall that tested at R19 behaves like something far weaker in a real winter. Then there's spray foam. Closed cell, high R per inch, expands to fill every crack. The brochures make it sound like magic in a drum. It can air seal beautifully, if installed perfectly, under perfect conditions by someone who actually cares. Get the mix off, miss a cavity, ignore drying potential, and you've built a very expensive sponge with no way to dry out. Rigid foam sheathing moves the insulation outside the studs, cutting thermal bridges. On paper, that's a huge win. But if it's too thin, every stud still prints through as a heat highway. Tape the seams badly, skip the flashing details, and your continuous insulation is continuous only in the marketing. Mineral wool, fireproof, water-resistant, holds its R when it's damp. It laughs at mice. But it still sits between cold studs, and it still depends on you controlling air, so it isn't a wind filter. All of these systems speak the language of one number, R15, R21, R30, as if comfort can be printed on a label. Now, let's see what Jacob built. Heavy mass, stone and log, and 1/8-inch cavity where the air could move just enough to spread heat, but not enough to become a draft. No pretty R value, no brochure, yet his cabin stayed warm while his neighbors shivered. What did this stubborn mountain man understand? He knew that stability matters more than a single number. Those stone-charged walls didn't chase peak insulation, they crushed temperature swings. The heat from his fire soaked into thousands of pounds of stone, then drifted back out slowly, long after the last ember dimmed. You can steal that trick. Combine exterior foam to cut those stud-to-outside thermal bridges, then give the inside some mass, a concrete or stone floor, a masonry interior wall, even thick plaster that can absorb and release heat. Pair that with ruthless air sealing, and suddenly your light modern shell starts behaving a lot more like a thermal battery. Before we reveal the exact technique Jacob used to charge his walls with fire, hold this in your mind. R value is only one dial. Marketing wants you to believe it's the dial, but comfort is a system. Mass, insulation, air sealing, and where you place the heat source all working together. Get that system right, and your cabin can feel warm in a way a number on a chart will never explain. So if comfort is a system, not a single number, why did almost every cabin in those mountains still follow the same bad script? The frontier had its own building gospel. Thicker logs always mean warmer. More windows are fine if you just burn more wood. Mass alone is enough. Air leaks don't matter if your walls are heavy. These weren't fringe opinions. This was everyone knows. Jacob looked at that gospel and quietly broke every line. Now, let's see what Jacob built that made his neighbors shake their heads. His cabin didn't actually use the thickest logs in the valley. A few trappers upriver had walls a full log thicker. On paper, they won. But Jacob's walls weren't just thick. They were layered. Outer log wall, inner log wall, and between them, 18 inches of tightly packed stone riding on a deep foundation that actually carried the weight instead of letting it sag and open gaps. Thicker logs alone still leak. Checks open, corners twist, wind finds every path. Jacob understood that mass without control is just heavy. So he wrapped his mass inside structure. The outer logs took the wind and the snow load. The inner logs held the heat and the living space. The stone in between did the slow, quiet work of storing energy. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about heat that 2 generations of frontiersmen had missed? That the path the air takes through a wall matters as much as the wall's size. Then there were the windows. Neighbors loved glass. Big pains if you could get them hauled over the pass. If it gets cold, you just throw in more wood. Jacob did the opposite. Few windows. Small, deeply recessed into that double wall so the cold air hit wood and stone before it ever touched his interior. Those deep reveals acted like built-in cold traps, killing drafts before they could rake across a sleeping child's face at 3 a.m. And the myth that mass alone would save you, that if you just built heavy enough, winter couldn't touch you, Jacob refused that too. He chased air, he scribed his sill logs tight to the stone foundation, packed every joint, and used breathable materials, moss, lime, clay, that could dry out instead of sealing in moisture. Skeptics swore that stone and tight chinking would mean rot, mold, a damp tomb of a cabin by the second winter. The record says otherwise. Repeated freeze-thaw cycles, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, nights, wind driving snow against that wall, and the structure stayed sound. Why? Drainage at the base. A foundation that lifted the wood out of splash and meltwater. A wall that could dry to the inside and the outside. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century. You can keep water out of the wrong places without wrapping a building in plastic. What looked like mistakes, extra work on the foundation, extra material in the cavity, fewer openings to the view, were targeted answers to specific failure points. Jacob had watched destroy cabins, corner gaps, wet sills, glass that bled heat. He wasn't guessing. He was editing the frontier cabin line by line. So here's your question. Which obvious truth about heat or building have you accepted without testing? That spray foam fixes everything? That bigger stoves mean warmer nights? That you can trade air sealing for more insulation? Because Jacob's little experiment in the Bridger Mountains says those assumptions might be the difference between survival and catastrophe. Before we reveal the exact technique he used to charge those stone-filled walls with fire, and why his cabin stayed warm hours after the last flame died, watch what happens the first time a real blizzard slams into this wrong design. The blizzard was the turning point. The next few winters were the proof. At first, nothing changed. New cabins went up along the creek with the same single log wall, the same shallow foundations half sunk in frozen mud, the same proud, oversized windows staring north into the teeth of the wind. This was normal. This was frontier life. And Jacob's double wall, stone-filled cabin was still the punchline to half the jokes around the stove at the trading post. But cold has a long memory, and so do people who've shivered through a Montana night. The first detail to quietly migrate wasn't the stone. It was thickness. You start seeing walls that are a log wider, a second layer of split boards hung on the inside like a liner. Not a full double wall, not this crazy thermal battery idea, just more. More wood between skin and cold. A small hedge against the wind that had failed them before. Then foundations. Men who once laughed at Jacob's steep stone footing start digging a little lower, stacking more rock under the sill. They don't say thermal mass. They say keeps the thaw from heaving the cabin, but those heavier bases also slow the crawl of cold up from the frozen ground. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that they were now copying without naming? Watch Samuel Creek. Samuel had been the loudest critic, the one who told Jacob he'd built a well with a roof on it. 2 winters later, when he raises a new cabin for his eldest son, something odd appears. An inner wall of rough boards, nailed a hand's breadth inside the logs. A crude air gap. No stone, no careful chinking in the cavity, just still air trapped between 2 skins of wood. The result? That cabin runs noticeably warmer, less draft along the floor, less ice crawling across the inside of the north wall by morning. Neighbors shrug and say, the timber must be better. Samuel doesn't rush to correct them. Now, let's see what Jacob built due to the sawmill economy. William Thorpe, who'd once sold nothing but standard logs and a few planks, starts stacking heavier timbers along one side of his yard. More stone piled near the loading bay. He doesn't give a speech about thermal mass. He just happens to have deeper sills, thicker plates, and wagon loads of riverstone ready when a rancher mentions the last winter nearly froze his children. Not one man in that valley builds a full Reinhardt double-wall, stone-filled cabin in those first years. They cherry-pick a thicker wall here. A smaller, higher window on the north face there. A second inner liner to trap a still air gap. Even partial adoption of the principles shifts the balance. Fires burn lower. Mornings feel less like crawling out of a snowbank. Before we reveal the exact technique that made Jacob's cabin act like a charged battery of heat, understand this. In a place where winter can be the difference between survival and catastrophe, imitation is quiet but relentless. Within a decade, the crazy cabin in the Bridger Mountains is no longer a joke. It's a reference point. Old men give directions by it. Young builders argue about how much stone you really need in a wall to stay warm. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century started here in a mocked cabin that the whole settlement eventually, piece by piece, copied. So how do you turn that crazy cabin in the Bridger Mountains into an actual plan for your own four walls? Not as a Pinterest fantasy, as a thought map, a checklist that might be the difference between survival and catastrophe when the wind starts to knife through your valley. Step 1. Air. Always air. Heat doesn't just leak through materials. It rides out on moving air like a thief in the night. Jacob understood this long before anyone could spell building science. His answer wasn't spray foam. It was stone and geometry. He built a deep stone foundation that carried the weight of 2 log walls, yes, but it also gave him a tight, continuous base, fewer gaps, fewer paths for wind to claw through the floor. Then he doubled the wall. Outer logs, inner logs chinked hard. That double shell turned the worst drafts into gentle, slow convection inside the cavity, instead of screaming through the cabin. What did this stubborn mountain man understand about the cold that his neighbors missed? You control air first, or the rest of your effort bleeds away. Step 2. Mass. Once you've stopped the wind from whistling through your life, you give the heat somewhere to live. Jacob's answer was that 8,000-pound stone band running around the cabin, a thermal flywheel. While the stove burned, those stones quietly charged, soaking in heat the way the mountains soak in late afternoon sun. This is where you start sketching, literally. Take a piece of paper, draw your room or cabin from above. Where's the stove or heater? Now, let's see what Jacob built and steal the idea. Could you stack brick or stone behind the stove? Could you build a low masonry bench that the flue runs past? Even a row of dense water barrels along an interior wall can act as a crude thermal battery. Step 3. Still air as insulation. Jacob didn't pack that whole cavity solid. The upper portion was an air gap, controlled and quiet. No wild convection, just a blanket of nearly still air between warm stone and cold outer logs. Before we reveal the exact technique he used in your terms, think about your own walls. If you rent, you're not tearing them open, but you can hang thick curtains over exterior walls, add interior storm windows with clear plastic and tape, build simple interior shutters. You're trapping air, slowing it, turning it into a reluctant conductor instead of an eager conveyor belt. Step 4. Heat placement. Jacob's stove sat near the center, where rising hot air could lick those stone walls from all sides. He wasn't just heating air, he was charging mass. In your sketch, move your heater mentally. Would shifting it toward an internal wall let you warm more mass and less outside surface? Could a small fan push hot air along a brick spine instead of straight into a window? And if you're on a small budget or stuck in a rental, you can still think like a frontier engineer. A bookcase filled with dense books against a cold wall, a movable stone or brick hearth panel you stand behind a space heater, heavy rugs on the floor, thick fabric across doorways. Crude, yes, but each one is another ounce of resistance against the winter. This is knowledge that's been buried for over a century, hiding in plain sight behind that mocked double wall. Observe where your cabin actually loses heat. Use simple physics, mass, air, placement, and be willing, like Jacob, to let the neighbors roll their eyes at your brick-lined living room, right up until the next cold front rolls over the mountains, and your cabin stays warm while theirs bleeds heat into the dark. Because once you start seeing your walls this way, the next question gets even stranger. What if you could make the sun do half the work for you? What if you could make the sun do half the work for you? In a world where energy grids flicker, gas prices spike overnight, and record-breaking winter headlines repeat like a broken record, the real villain isn't the cold. The cold is honest. The real enemy is the quiet, invisible drip of heat leaking through walls that were never designed to truly hold it. Most modern buildings do this. Your cabin, your house, the office tower downtown. Heat goes in, heat goes out, and the meter just keeps spinning. We insulate the roof, we throw fiberglass in the studs, we slap on marketing words like R value and high efficiency and call it good. But if the walls are a sieve of thermal bridges, cracks, and flimsy details, you're just paying to warm the outdoors. Jacob didn't have that luxury. His frontier reality was brutally simple: limited firewood, brutal winters, and no backup generator humming in the corner when the temperature hit minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit and the wind screamed off the mountains. For him, every BTU burned in that little stove had to count. That was the difference between survival and catastrophe. Now, let's see what Jacob built compared to us. He stacked stone between double log walls because he had no choice. You, on the other hand, live in a world where the construction industry has a choice and often chooses speed, cost, and advertising over deep comfort and resilience. Thin walls go up fast, spray foam photographs well, brochures glow with thermal images. But where are the thick, quiet, high-mass walls that keep heat moving slowly, calmly, under your control? What did this stubborn mountain man understand that we keep ignoring? He understood that when the grid goes down for a week, when a polar vortex parks over your town, or when diesel deliveries stop for logistical reasons, it's not your thermostat brand that saves you. It's how your walls handle time, how long they can coast when the fire goes out, when the gas valve closes, when your solar batteries are empty and the night is still 12 hours long. Designs like Jacob's are more than historical curiosities. They are a quiet form of independence. A cabin that stays warm on half the firewood is a cabin that needs fewer chainsaw blades, fewer propane deliveries, fewer fragile systems humming in the background, less noise, less anxiety, more time sitting by the window, watching the snow instead of feeding a frantic, hungry stove. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century is suddenly relevant again, because you, right now, have a choice. You can keep accepting invisible leaks, heat bleeding through lightweight walls, comfort held hostage by a distant substation, or you can begin, room by room, to build your own fortress against cold. Maybe it's a brick-lined interior wall, a dense earthen bench by the stove, a small cabin retrofitted with unexpected mass. And if stone and timber can do this much on their own, what happens when you aim that fortress directly at the sun? What happens when you aim that fortress directly at the sun? That question is where Jacob's mistake stops being a quirky frontier story and starts becoming your next project. Because remember his full arc. The man who built a cabin that looked wrong from the road, the man whose neighbors joked he'd freeze first when real winter hit, and the same neighbors who, after the coldest winter in decades, quietly measured his walls and copied them board for board. He went from village cautionary tale to blueprint. Now, let's see what Jacob built in terms of lessons you can actually use. Under all the log drama and neighbor gossip, there were 3 simple, ruthless ideas. First, control air before you chase R value. Jacob's double wall and tight chinking killed drafts. No howling wind through gaps, no invisible jets of cold sneaking behind his stove. If you do nothing else, sealing that one leaky corner or that window trim that breathes like a flute can change how your cabin feels more than another inch of insulation. Second, add mass where you live, not out in the shed, not in a decorative garden wall, right where your body sits and sleeps. Jacob stacked nearly 8,000 pounds of stone into the zone where his family actually occupied the cabin, from floor to 7 feet. That's why the wall stayed warm to the touch hours after the fire died. A brick half wall behind your wood stove, a dense earthen bench along the north side, even a filled block wall near your favorite chair can do the same thing on a smaller scale. Third, treat the wall as a system, not a single barrier. His outer logs blocked the Montana wind. The inner surface saw the room. The stone and controlled air gap in between acted like a thermal battery, with just enough convection to move heat, not enough to strip it away. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that so many thick-wall cabins missed? That uncontrolled air currents and solid thermal bridges can drain heat faster than thin insulation on paper. So what do you actually do next, sitting there watching this? You do not need a full Reinhardt cabin in the mountains to start. Pick one move. 1. Seal the draft under the door that ices your ankles every January. Sketch a double-wall shed you can experiment with next summer. Plan a small interior mass wall behind your stove instead of another flimsy panel. This is not about being handy. It's about understanding why you're cold. If you want to go deeper, this video is just one chapter in a bigger investigation. We've linked full builds on off-grid heating, thermal mass benches, and wall experiments where we deliberately break designs to see how they fail. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century is sitting there in those tests, waiting for you to steal it before the next power outage or polar vortex turns your place into a refrigerator. You stayed through a long, detailed winter in 1876 for a reason, because the difference between survival and catastrophe, between a warm cabin and a cold box, is never just the stove. It's the why behind the warmth. And once you see that, you can't walk past your own walls the same way again. So here's where this stops being a frontier story and starts being a mirror. Jacob stared at a bare patch of ground and imagined a wall that every neighbor would laugh at. You're staring at your own walls right now, in a world with thinner margins and bigger storms. And you get to decide, do you keep doing what looks normal, or do you build your own mistake on purpose? Now, let's see what Jacob built in terms of mindset, not just timber and stone. He overbuilt where it mattered. He accepted that his cabin would look wrong in October so it could feel right in January. What did this stubborn mountain man understand that everyone else on that ridge missed? That the cold doesn't care about fashion. The cold only respects physics, mass, and preparation. So here's your challenge. Drop one Jacob move in the comments. One thing you're planning to build, change, or overdo that your friends, your neighbors, or your contractor might roll their eyes at, but that makes sense for heat, resilience, and comfort when the lights go out. Maybe it's doubling up the insulation on one north wall. Maybe it's adding an inner liner wall to your cabin with a still air gap. Maybe it's a ridiculous-looking thermal curtain over that leaky patio door. Name it. Claim it. Put it in writing so the next winter, when your place stays warm, you can scroll back and remember exactly when you decided to stop building for appearances and start building for survival. Before we reveal the exact technique in a future video with numbers you can't argue with, I want to turn Jacob's experiment into yours. If you want to see a modern recreation of that double log stone-filled wall, hit to head with a standard framed wall. Hit subscribe. We're talking real thermometers, thermal cameras, same size cabin, same stove, same storm. No frontier legends, just data. Knowledge that's been buried for over a century, dragged into a freezing modern test. And if you want to quietly annoy the invisible villain in this story, the lazy, shallow way we build walls that hemorrhage heat, hit like. Share this with the one friend who brags about their cabin but never talks about the power bill. Every click is a tiny vote against wasted wood, wasted watts, and the idea that comfort is only for people on the grid. Then ask yourself one last question. In the next big storm, the next blackout, the next week where the mountains lock down and the road is just a rumor, do you want to be in the cabin that looks normal from the road, or the one everybody said was a mistake until they stepped inside and felt their eyelashes thaw? Picture the final shot. Wind howling, snow ripping sideways past the eaves. Jacob's thick door swings shut with that solid, heavy sound, the kind you feel in your chest. Outside, darkness and cold. Inside, stone and wood glowing with stored heat, walls radiating a quiet, steady warmth. Sometimes the ideas that keep you warmest in winter are the ones that look wrong at first. Build that cabin. Then let the storm be your witness.